Hi there, good morning, and welcome to this first plenary of the day with Richard Florida. My name is Peter Maskell. I've been asked to chair this session and to say a few words of introduction to a person who doesn't need any introduction. Nevertheless, Richard was born 1957. He went to Rutgers, to Columbia, took up a position at Carnegie Mellon, and started what became a string of quite influential papers and books. One of the first still used beyond mass production, co-authored with Martin Kenny, one of the old hands of DRUID, been here many times, 93. Went on to talk about high tech, the geography of innovation with Marian Feldman, who's on our board here. Had a paper, the very first of the learning region. This is amazing, still used, came out in 95. Had a paper far earlier than any others on the Dean in the Green about environmental issues, 96. Talked about globalization, 97, and so on, agglomeration, industrial location, social capital, public transport, cities, and whatever, you name it. You were all over the field journals, Regional Studies, the Californian Management Review, a few pieces in Journal of Economic Geography, Research Policy, American Sociological Review, many of these papers here. Altogether 82 papers and publications over these years here, covering this vast field. This is worth recognizing, and he had a number of citations, 3,000 according to Reuters, the Web of Science. But what is amazing here is not the number of references to his journal papers, that is the amount of references to his books. And of course, most remarkably to the book of the creative class, The Rise of the Creative Class, came out in 2002. If you look at this book alone, it had more than 5,000 references in scientific journals. Go to Google Scholar, have 15,000, and if you look at all the policy papers, it's enormous. It has really made an impact. And I remember I happened to be at Howard at the time where this book was launched, and the people at the Kennedy School, they had organized a small introduction and a talk, and Richard came there, gave his talk, and I also recall that after we stood there chatting, with this curious mix of being excited and having sort of degree of disbelief. He talked about his publisher sending me off now to a road trip, a string of organized talks throughout the country where he would earn an unbelievable honoraria, and off he went. Little to be heard of in our circles for a period of time, but obviously, his message filled the void, and obviously it was not just the message, but also the messenger who made a tremendous impact in these policy circles for the next few years. And while we watched in some kind of amazement from outside, then I think our common friend, Mary Gertler, the professor of economic geography and now the vice chancellor of University of Toronto, he summarized sort of the general feeling, the general response to all this by saying it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Wow. And we could say that, of course, this kind of success we wouldn't be academics if not. It drew a lot of criticism, or at least some criticism over the years. There was this line of criticism from people who said, there's nothing new in all this. You know, all these people here, they're hearing things that have been out there for a number of years, and one would assume that earlier people said it even better, according to them. And there was another quarter who criticized Richard's work from being, well, the novelty of it was, if at best unsupported, unjustified, and at worst plainly wrong. And I've had a look at these kind of criticism now, reread them, and what is amazing here is not that they are not pointed, and good, of course they are, and Richard responded, I think, accordingly, but some of these guys, they could be quite nasty, and in this case here, they're so polite, they're so nice. they put a lot of emphasis on what he's actually been doing all the time, and that is bringing a message about urban economics to policymakers in a more targeted and more compelling way than any other guy did before him. And I think this needs to be recognized for talking about his work. Now, there was a third line of criticism, and that had to do with a tendency in the work, and I think in a lot of other work in our community, that it whitewashed some of the negative effects of what was going on. So we were studying something, and it had some consequences that perhaps were less favorable. And sort of in the spirit of DRUID, the organizers of the conference, and Mark in particular, contacted Richard and asked him, could he perhaps say a few words about this at a coming conference? And they were delighted that he almost immediately accepted, and they agreed on a title of Creativity, Innovation, and Inequality. This is a title that Richard is going to talk to us today. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Freude.
Peter, thank you. Peter, thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Mark, and the organizers for inviting us here. So I learned three things from your introduction. One, thank you for that quote from my dear friend Merrick. I'd never heard that before, and that really touched me. But the two other things are really important, that I am old. I just figured that out, that I'm old. And secondly, that my critics got a lot of things right in a daunting way. And I think it's had, we'll talk about that. I think it's had a very positive effect both on me as a scholar, but it's made me a much humbler individual. And I thank my critics for that. Because that was the purpose of the book. And the purpose of the book, we'll get to, was to really bring your ideas and your work and work of people in this field of innovation studies and the great mentors and role models I learned from, to marry that with some theories about cities that I learned from who became a good friend late in life, Jane Jacobs. So I want to talk about a few things and then leave time for questions. And as Peter said, I don't shy away from criticism. I've learned pretty well how to deal with it. And leave us some time for questions. And I want to hang around for most of the day, so if you miss me, I want to hear Zoltan and David and Tom and this afternoon, because they're all dear friends of mine. And so I want to hang around and get to know some of you who I might never have met. I think the best way for me to start is to start with where I come from and why this is important to me personally. Actually, I come from not far from here. My grandparents, all four of them, are from Avellino, a little bit south and west of here, and they came to the United States at the turn of the 20th century. I was born in Newark. I was really working class, not screwing around working class, really blue-collar working class. I had the tough guy accent, soprano's accent to prove that, and I was lucky. I had two very loving parents who believed in education. Peter already established that I'm aged. I was born in 1957, but if you scroll back in your mind's eye, that's very important to my intellectual development. Because I was born into Newark, New Jersey, when it was a thriving, bustling, commercial and residential center. I was born into what we would think of as the Italian and Jewish ghetto of North Newark. I remember the big gatherings at my Italian grandmother's house of the whole extended multitudes of family. I remember the bustling shops. And I also remember two specific things that happened in my youth that only when writing Rise of the Creative Class I put together. The first thing I remember was the great civil rights unrest and the riots of 1967. I was a 10-year-old boy, and if you remember your own, or if you have children that age, it's a very inquisitive time. So the fact that a bustling, thriving city could explode into flames and rifle fire, and that literally armed vehicles, tanks, could be in the streets of my city was, in a way I was not at all aware of, obviously made quite a big intellectual impression. And the second thing that will become much more evident to those of you who've read any of my work, my dad worked in an eyeglass factory. I tell great stories in my books about my father and my mother. My dad worked in an eyeglass factory. He got that job at when he was in the 7th grade. He turned 13, worked in that eyeglass factory until he was 65. I watched that eyeglass factory in the ironbound section of Newark go through industrial decay, horrific management. My father always said this, if you know about tacit learning and tacit knowledge and shop floor and all of the stuff that I later studied with Martin Kenny, my father told me these stories first. He said something like, Rich, they put those goddamn engineers and MBAs in there and they screwed up the entire factory. We knew how to do it right. And I think all of those things were swirling around my head. I was a hippie. I played rock and roll. I didn't want to be part of the establishment. I got a Garden State Scholarship to Rutgers. I got interested in urbanism. I became a lost-in-the-woods neo-Marxist. You should read my undergraduate and graduate theses for studies in incomprehensible jargon. And wrote on housing and urban affairs and urban decay. And then I got a position. Well, this Garden State Scholarship to Rutgers changed my life. It really did, and I just need 1 second on that. If you grow up in a peer group of tough guys like me, who are intellectually smart and pragmatically very good, have a lot of common sense, a lot of street wisdom, my life could have made a very different turn. There was a big fork in the road that happens about 16 or 17. I was young for my grade. That Garden State Scholarship to Rutgers changed my life. Because it took me, and if you read urban sociology now, these effects are becoming well known. It took me out of a very problematic peer group where I was not allowed to be smart. I had to hide the fact that I was smart and intellectually curious. And it put me in a peer environment where I could thrive at Rutgers College. Anyway, I was an awful, many of you will say I still am an awful scholar, but that's neither here nor there. I was an awful scholar after graduate school, terrible. I was the consummate neo-Marxist bullshit essayist, sorry. And then I got a job at Ohio State University, and I met Martin Kenny. And Martin Kenny and it is so remarkable what that meeting did. I still remember it. We met one day, and Martin came to my office, and he had bushy hair and a mustache at the time, and he said, "What are you working on?" I said, "I'm working on this housing and finance and urban decay." I said, He had this great book on biotech from Yale Press. He'd gotten accolades for it. We uttered these magic words, and I still remember it. We said, "What if we studied venture capital?" And every time we said those 2 magic words, we got another grant. And I knew we were onto something. So Martin and I began 2 important lines of inquiry. One, we began a line of inquiry, which I think got me tenure, on venture capital, innovation, and regional development. And the second line of inquiry we began was an inquiry on modern manufacturing management. I could talk a lot about that, but in that we tried to marry Martin's interest in innovation and innovation studies. He had been to Japan many times. He understood what Toyota production, what later became known as lean production. And we had a great group of people there, a great group of graduate students. But I think at that time, what we really started to do was delve into work in innovation studies, the work that all of you know so well, and so many of you here were our mentors. First, we both came from this kind of interesting period of neo-Marxism where we were reading Marx, we were reading Nate Rosenberg for sure, we were learning about Schumpeter, we were learning from the European, the French and Italian regulation theorists, but when we stumbled upon Chris's work, and I still remember meeting Chris. This is really interesting, and I wrote about this when he died. I remember meeting him at a conference in Ottawa, and I was still trying to figure out my own intellectual path, and I said, "So you're a Schumpeterian, right? You've studied this guy Schumpeter." And he said, "No, basically, Rich, I was a Marxist when I was young, but no one would publish my work when I used the word Marx, so I substituted the word Schumpeter from Marx." I said, "Oh, that's clever. That's really clever." And then, of course, we discovered the work of Dick Nelson and Sid Winter. And what an impact that made. And I had this whole career in kind of innovation and management studies. Peter was so kind to run off some of the articles and essays we produced. We did this remarkable, we actually went to Harvard Business School library and coded all the venture capital deals by hand and tried to look at this association between venture capital and high-tech innovation. What we discovered is supply of venture capital means nothing. It was demand for deals. It was such an obvious thing. We began to study Japanese factories, and we began to actually, because Martin was a field researcher and he taught me how to be a field researcher, and we would go and actually walk the factory floors. And I still remember this. We toured all these great modern factories, and we were watching the old US factories decline and the old auto plants close. And one day we were in Japan, outside Nagoya, and walked into this steel rolling mill. And I remember asking the plant manager, how was this cold rolling process that was taken from a series of discrete batch processes, how was this discrete set of batch processes turned into this continuous cold rolling process that took like 12 minutes? It looked like literally rolling a coil of paper or even toilet paper. And I said, what great scientists, what great Carnegie Mellon metallurgical materials engineers, what great research lab at the University of Tokyo? And he said, you got it all wrong, Professor Florida. This was done by the folks who work on this factory floor. The factory itself is a living laboratory. And that drew me right back to what my father had told me when I was a young boy and visited his factory. It's the story I tell in the book. I'll make it very brief. I wanted to know where my dad worked. I begged him to take me to the factory. On Saturdays, when the factory ran overtime, he would relent, and I remember me going into this giant brick factory in Newark, watching the machines, and my dad tapped me on the shoulder at 10, 11, 12 at the time, and he said, Richard, it's not the machines that make this factory great. It's the knowledge, it's the intelligence, it's the creativity of the people who work here. So I wasn't yet there. I was now beginning to do two streams of research. One stream of research on innovation and modern management, and in the back of my mind, cities. I went to Carnegie Mellon, and I met Wes Cohen. A completely life-changing experience. I met a young graduate student named Mary Ann Feldman, who many of you will know. And with Wes, I began to understand what real research is. Here's a guy completely untrained, an urban essayist. Now I began to understand what this thing called a regression was, and quantitative analysis, and how you do that, and how you control for things. That's not my thing. I'll tell you about my thing in a minute. But I began to learn. I met Tom Asterborough, and with Wes, we did a series of remarkable studies, which you all know. I learned more about his field. I met Zoltan and David, and that was very interesting because they had this very curious measure of product innovation, if you remember it. And what I said to Mary Ann, who at that time was looking for a thesis topic, what if we marry this stuff to geography? Don't ask me why I said that. Don't ask me how I said that. I had never really done it in my own work. And what a tremendous success. The stream of papers that Mary Ann and Zoltan and David published in that area. But what it got me thinking, and Herb Simon was such a freaking genius. He told me two things. He said, Richard, you have a capacity at induction, use it. Use it. Don't be convinced by everybody else who says you have to deduce. You have a capacity for induction, use it. But he said the other thing, which he told many people, he said, where you're more likely to have an advance that matters, especially if you're not very talented or not very good like me, is if you can find two fields that haven't been married adequately. Just in the back of my mind, this wasn't conscious, I wasn't aware of it, and I began to think, this field of innovation studies is quite robust. This field of innovation studies has an actual history. It has an intellectual tradition underpinned by Schumpeter's work, Chris's work, Nelson and Wynne. I mean, this is a rich, robust tradition for which there needs to be a Nobel Prize. For which there needs to be a Nobel Prize, for sure. It's one of the most important advances in economics of my life. And maybe Jane Jacobs said this to me. Jane Jacobs said to me, later you'll get to my marriage. Hold it, 1 second. I wanted to marry cities to innovation. My field of cities was an intellectual backwater. Think about it. The research in the field was essayistic. It comes from geography, a humanistic tradition. Nothing wrong with that. It's quite descriptive. Urban economics at the time was all micro-driven. Ed Glazer still hadn't gotten his PhD. So you had a field that was very amorphous and very problematic, and I said, holy shit. If I can take any bit of the rigor in this field of innovation and apply it to cities, I'm likely to hit at least a double, maybe a triple, and maybe, if I'm really lucky, I'm going to hit a home run. So I began to try to think about how to do this. And I was flailing around, as anyone working in a new area of inquiry would do. And that's my point. I met Jane Jacobs. I met Jane Jacobs when she was in her 80s. She was remarkable. She hated university. She hated professors. When she had gotten the idea for what became her landmark, she wrote 3 landmark books, but Death and Life of Great American Cities. She was invited up to Harvard, to the Joint Center for Urban Studies, where they tried to tell her what to do. You should do a study survey. You should do quantitative research. She said, I'm a field worker. I don't have a PhD. She said, Richard, if what they tried to do to me, they do to their graduate students, I knew to stay away from those people. She said, I think I figured out something that has been quite daunting for economists. Listen to what she said. I could not believe this, because I had never read it in her books. This is before I wrote Rise of the Creative Class. She said, most economists work on the theory of efficiency and the division of labor and the theory of the firm. I'm translating this because she used more simple language. And what they're trying to do is study the division of labor and really how an economy moves down an efficiency frontier, how firms and economies become more efficient. And then the coda, and then she had me. She said, I think if I'm to be remembered, I've created one insight that's enduring, and it's not about sidewalk structure, and it's not about the rhythms and tempos of cities and all the other stuff that people give me accolades. I think I figured out where growth comes from. And here goes my ears. She figured out where growth comes from. And she didn't mention any of the work I knew. She said, if you look at cities, cities are different than firms. Because what cities do is they bring together combinations of firms and combinations of people to create new work. Cities are where innovations are born. And she said, while firms can make things more efficient, cities are where innovations come from. And I just said, that's it. That's it. So, Peter, I am derivative, completely derivative. And what I tried to do, and where I think my critics are, simply marry these two ideas. To take basically a Mark Schumpeter, Rosenbergian, Nelson Winter, we could go on, Cohen, we can add to that flavor, and simply to say that if we change the unit of analysis from firm to city, and I made a big logical leap. You can tell me I'm completely wrong. The logical leap I made is that the city might be a better unit, an alternative unit, a complementary unit. Who knows how to phrase that best? I'm speaking here without the help of an editor, trying to be as clear as I can. That the city itself, this collection of people and firms, because I wasn't quite yet at my theory, was a better unit of analysis, and I made this incredible supposition. I said, what if? Because Peter mentioned my piece on the learning community. I had been mucking around with Kenny, post-Fordism, post-capitalism, post-industrialism, knowledge economy, learning society. I've been mucking around in this water for a decade. I said, what if the city itself is a core social and economic organizing unit of modern capitalism? And what if in knowledge capitalism, because I was reading my Dan Bell and Peter Drucker, what if in knowledge capitalism, this shift from industrial to post-industrial to what Drucker called knowledge and Mauser called knowledge capitalism, what if the city was becoming more important? What if, I said, the city itself was supplanting the firm, and then light bulbs started going off in my head. I was watching the high-tech revolution, the dot-com revolution. I was teaching at Carnegie Mellon, a place where technology and engineering, I was studying, looking at my students go to tech companies, making their own personal migration decisions, very influenced by this huge literature coming out of Italy on industrial districts. And I was watching this literature, Mike Storper, Michael Porter, we could go on and on. Annalise Saxenian, all the people who had a huge influence on me. Ann Markison, Ben Harrison. The unit of analysis was the firm. The unit of analysis was the firm. So I began to get a little bit angry, a little bit perturbed. Don't ask me why. And what I was seeing, because remember, Kenny and I were doing field work in the Silicon Valley. We were visiting the Silicon Valley. We were meeting with venture capitalists. We were talking to high-tech companies. And we were getting this line of argumentation that it wasn't so much firms that, of course, firms matter. I'm discounting this highly. Of course, firms matter. But it was this collective entity called the community, called the district, called the cluster, and it was this ability to leverage sources of talent, what economists would call human capital. And I was watching this, and sitting at Carnegie Mellon, and watching how valuable this human capital, personified in individuals and talent, was. And watching these young people and my faculty colleagues leave Pittsburgh, I began to get captivated by what I called the Pittsburgh paradox. Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon faculty members, West taught me this. On a per capita basis, we're as productive as those at Stanford or MIT, yet there was nothing in the area of a technology cluster. So I was reading Mike Porter's work and reading work on other industrial clusters, and I said, what if not only do we focus on cities, what if we look at clusters of people, not just clusters of firms? And I think this is the first, and I think this is the major innovation that comes through in rise of creative class. A work at the time, which I said, which is a work of synthesis, trying to synthesize these various approaches. And I remember I had two phenomenal, we had a census research center at Carnegie Mellon at the time. Gary Gates, who's now a professor at UCLA, Kevin Stolarik, who was my partner for intellectual partner for a long time. I said, what if we could look at clusters of people? And those guys said, that's easy. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has detailed data in this census data center on where people classified by 800 occupations cluster. So I remember I put those guys on that, and I took another student and I said, let's look at the evolution of occupations over time. And I went out to market with a book called Get Real, What's Really New About the Economy. Work, Life, Time, Place, Understanding the Rebirth of the Knowledge Economy. And I sold the book to Basic Books, a fantastic editor who's now at Yale called Bill Frucht. If you want to do important work, Bill is the smartest editor I've ever met. He bought the book. It was completely amorphous. It was a descriptive study. So they came back with the analysis of these Bureau of Labor Statistics occupations. And we took scientists and technologists, engineers, architects, physical scientists, mathematicians, computer scientists, media workers, Drucker's kind of knowledge workers, plus the Schumpeterian science and technology workers. And then I said, what about these artsy-fartsy people? Let's put them in. Artists, musicians, designers. I was a guitar player as a kid. I'm always interested in design. They came back, and this group had grown from about 5% of the workforce in 1900 to about 10% in 1950. By the year 2000, it was about a third. And when I looked at the intermetropolitan variation, my jaw hit the floor. You had metros where this group was 15% and metros where this group was 40%, and I said, holy shit. And I brought this to New York to my meeting with the editor. And he said, Richard, you have the rise of a new class. I was going to call the book The Big Morph. Just think about this. I was going to go to market with this book called The Big Morph, The Change in Our Knowledge Economy. My editor's like, this is a class. I'm like, no, it's not a class. We can't talk about classes. We don't talk about classes. We talk about clusters. He said, no, 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 no. And literally at the last minute, we titled the book The Rise of the Creative Class. And it was about the growth of this group of, now, I never knew it would catch on. I thought it would do about as well as my other three books, that Beyond Math Production, The Breakthrough Illusion, that sold about 12 copies, and my parents bought all of them. And the book actually was slow to take off. It was really slow to take off. And I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, and there was a kid who wrote for Salon magazine, one of the first internet magazines. And he said, I should do an interview with you. He said, for a blog. I said, what? What's a blog? Really? What's a blog? I have no idea. So he came over to my house, and I rented a house from Carnegie Mellon. We sat in the backyard. He did that interview. And then Paul Glastris, a really remarkable editor at the Washington Monthly, remarkable intellect, but also remarkable because he was injured on electronic cables, and he has very, very limited use of his hands and fingers. And he read it, and something hit him, and he said, I'm going to write something, excerpt this in the Washington Monthly. The book came out in March. This stuff didn't come out till well after that visit to the Kennedy School. And I will never live down that headline. Why gays and rock bands are the key to the future of your city. That one headline made Rise of the Creative Class a bestseller. It just shows me the power of a media. Now, that book is 120,000 words. The conversation about gays and rock bands is probably on the order of 5,000 words. And guess what the book was known for? That's an interesting story. And I just met a colleague at the Rotman School, another colleague who's here, working at London Business School, and they made a similar discovery. I don't want to put words in their mouth. I met Mark Nolan at the Peterson Institute, and he and Howard Peck made a similar discovery. Anyone who works in this field of socioeconomic tolerance has to have a good sense of humor. And I met this young man named Gary Gates. He was a gay man. He was studying the propagation of AIDS. He's the leading student of gay demography in the world. He's at the UCLA Williams Institute now. And I still remember, I was talking with Wes, Ashish Arora. I was looking at these concentrations of these, what I was calling the high-tech knowledge think workers at the time, not the creative class. And Gary said, tell me the 5 leading concentration areas of these high-tech think workers, knowledge workers. I said, that's San Francisco, it's the Bay Area, it's Boston, it's Austin, it's San Diego. He said, you've just named the 5 gayest cities in America. And this was a joke. And that's what these young folks told me. They went into this with almost a critical eye, an amusing eye. Jamie, Mark Nolan and Howard Peck told me they were sitting in the cafeteria at the Peterson Institute wondering why Middle Eastern economies didn't develop, even ones that were more secular and less, at the time, energy independent. And Howard said, that's really easy, because when my niece goes to the Middle East to do with this fashion stuff and have fashion, and she goes with her gay colleagues, they don't want to talk to her because she's a young woman with a short skirt with gay. They started to look at how attitudes towards gay and lesbian people affected attitudes towards globalization and national economic performance. What we did was look at 2 things. The concentration of gay and lesbian people, because Gary had built this measure and published it in very good economics journals and demography journals, and then the concentration in clusters of so-called cultural and artistic creatives. And when the statistical results came back, and these are with pretty good Carnegie Mellon researchers' eyes on them, we couldn't get over the result. The fact that no matter how we lagged the variables, no matter how we contorted the variables, no matter how we added controls, that there were statistically significant and positive signs associated with high levels of innovation, high levels of patenting, high levels of high-tech economic clustering, and on and on and on and on, higher incomes. And both these concentrations of artistically and culturally creative people, artists, musicians, and so forth, and concentrations of gay, particularly gay men. And so we had to have fun with this, so we named one the Bohemian Index and the other one the gay factor, and wink, wink. We never believed, 1, the level of attention, and 2, the level of, something I can come back. I had never had such thoroughgoing reviews in my life. And then the popular critique came back, which was an eye-opener for me. Richard Florida is foisting his artsy-fartsy, yuppie, gay agenda on the world. And then it dawned on me. I was a middle-aged white man. It dawned on me for the first time that actually intellectual contributions can be framed in certain ways, and it was an incredible growth experience. In any event, the book became successful. It became something that public policy officials looked at. It became, let's say, used in ways that I found to be sometimes appropriate, sometimes inappropriate. I had argued against large-scale funding for stadiums. Mayors argued that stadiums were necessary to attract the creative class. I had argued against large-scale funding. I'm a Jane Jacobs person. Against large-scale funding for big symphonies and ballets. Mayors argued that those were important to attract the creative class. The academic debate was much better, and I think focused on all of the issues Peter pointed out. But I think over time, 2 things come through, and I don't want to go into this. We could talk about this more in question and answers. And I think I reprised them in the revised edition of the book, the 10th anniversary, and in a major essay I just wrote for Economic Development Quarterly, and then in a series of handbook chapters. I think there were 2 things that are interesting about that book. One is the use of this occupational measure. And I will only note on that case that not only did Marlitz and Van Werken and Todd Gabe and others find this occupation. So what we tried to do was define human capital not simply by the standard educational attainment measure. The educational attainment measure that most every economist uses is the share of people with the equivalent of a tertiary education or a bachelor's degree and above. I wanted a measure that was more heterogeneous. The occupational measure gives you 800 occupations to choose from. Bachelor's degree and above is a pretty homogeneous measure. You can't really look at skill. You can't really find detailed data on who has a bachelor's degree in science or technology or computer science or social science. But the measure, the occupational measure, and that education measure excludes people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs who don't have a bachelor's degree in their quantification of skill. What I thought we could look at is not only the overall measure, and in subsequent work with Charlotta Melander, we did a very interesting job of this. We could look at the occupations that are associated with high levels of innovation and growth. What we found is that 3 clusters are very important: science and technology, business and management, and arts, culture, media, and entertainment. So I thought that was very interesting, and even though Ed Glaser wrote a very critical review of the book, positive in some ways, critical in others, later he came back and in a series of paper, never crediting us, by the way, which is fine, the occupational measure is superior. Superior in trying to gauge economic performance. The occupational measure is a better measure of skill than the educational measure. Now, my colleagues at the Rotman School, like Will Strange, have gone even further and extracted from those same BLS surveys actual measures of underlying skill, which are really fascinating. Cognitive skill versus social engagement management skill versus physical and routine skill. So I think that was a contribution. I don't know what's better. I like my measure a lot. I think it is both good intellectually, but very good pragmatically. If you're a city trying to figure out what you're strong in, you can say I'm strong in bachelor's degrees, or you could say I'm strong in these occupational clusters. And we just wrote a paper for Mike Porter, the 20th anniversary of competitive strategy, trying to marry the industrial and occupational measures of clusters. The second thing that I think that book did that was very interesting was introduce what I called, look, I didn't do this for scholars, I did this for my mom. My mom always said, Richard, you have to do 3 things in life, the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're not actually 3 R's when you think about it for more than a millisecond. So I said, what could I communicate an idea to mayors who have less of an attention span than my mother? The 3 T's. The first T's are so self-evident that they don't even merit any conversation. Technology, well, that's my debt to Schumpeter and Rosenberg and Nelson and Winter and this whole field. That's a solo, that's a no-brainer. Technology. If you're going to have an economic strategy that wins, you have to invest in technology, have great universities, blah, blah, blah. That you know. The second one I said is not only that, because I watched technology migrate away from Pittsburgh, I said you have to invest in talent. Well, that's a no-brainer. That's human capital accumulation. That's Barrow and Romer, and we can go on and on. That's quite human capital accumulation. Call it talent. The third one is the controversial one, tolerance. I originally called it trade, but our research was so convincing to me on this score that places that were open-minded, places that could inculcate diversity, places that were open to men and women, straight and gay, ethnic and racial diversity had an edge in attracting talent. And I simply pointed to the Bay Area. The Bay Area was quite open to many different kinds of people. It was an area that was quite a musically innovative area. Seattle was the same, Austin was the same. They were also quite open to the gay and lesbian population. I did not make a direct correlation. I said the two were associated, like everyone else who's worked in this field. So I think that's still a debate over, and I still think it's an important area of inquiry, what I would call the social and cultural factors that add to and complement these economic hard factors of technology and tolerance. Well, Peter just gave me the 5-minute signal, and I want to leave time for questions. So let me just segue into what I learned. What I learned, and I think this is partly as a result of my critics, but partly as a result of the passage of time. When I started to write Rise of the Creative Class, it was the mid-90s. Cities were still down and out. There still wasn't research that showed any movement of skilled people back to cities. This was some of the first work that was trying to say, our world of high tech economic organization, our world of skill and innovation was urban. Now, there are good reasons in theory to believe this. If you believe Jane Jacobs, if you believe Bob Lucas, if you believe the theory of urban clustering, you would sense, and I did, that innovation has to be urban. That innovation comes from the complex combination and recombination of human beings and firms in the most densely packed places on Earth. But that's not what we were seeing. We were seeing high-tech complexes in what my great friend and sometimes debate partner Joel Kotkin calls the suburban Nerdistan, the industrial park a la Silicon Valley. So I was trying to make the case that innovation and technology and skill were moving back to cities. 15 years later, you look up and you go, holy moly. This has happened in a way I could not have predicted. When Kenny and I did our research, New York City was a major center of venture capital funds and barely had $1 of venture capital investment. Now Lower Manhattan attracts $3 billion in venture capital a year. We've looked at all the Thomson Reuters data at the zip code level. London is one of the leading centers of attracting venture capital. Venture capital is no longer dominant in the Silicon Valley. It has a lot. The dominant locus, more than $7 billion annually, is in the urban districts of San Francisco. So my new book, which I also went to market with a horrible title called Re-Urbia, I sat down in a hotel lobby with the brilliant young editor at Basic Books. I've gone back to Basic Books, where Bill was an editor. We did Rise of the Creative Class. And she said, there's a book I want you to write. And it's called The New Urban Crisis. The New Urban Crisis. And I thought about that for 2 years. And I finally said, you're right, Lara, you're right. I'm going to write that book. And for the past 2 years, I've worked on it. And I have a draft. They're not going to publish it, they say, till after the election, because they say the elections take all the air out of books. I don't believe them. I want it to come out, but it'll come out in about 1.5 years. And what I've tried to do is look at a simple phenomenon. Just when we thought our cities have come back, just when we thought our cities are attracting people of skill, just when we thought we've escaped the old urban crisis, our cities are faced with a new and ever daunting more set of challenges. So I've written a series of reports at the Martin Prosperity Institute on inequality in cities. And what do you find? Inequality is not only caused by globalization, it's not only caused by technological change, it's not only caused by skill bias, technical change. Inequality is positively and significantly associated with large and highly skilled cities, and more research suggests that inequality itself has a place-based dimension. More than that, what do you find even bigger? You find that segregation increases, this physical and social and geographic separation of people by race. But what we've tried to look at is economic segregation on class terms, education terms, income terms. The larger and bigger and more propulsive you get a city, the more segregated it gets. But the segregation in our cities is no longer along city and suburban lines. And that's where this gets really fascinating. It's no longer the old, what urbanists would call the hole in the donut, the migration of skill and talent and firms out of the city, but it's not also what a guy named Alan Aaron Hall calls a great inversion. It's not the total movement of skill and talent back to cities. It's fractal. It's a pattern of what I guess the best word I can use, a patchwork. A patchwork trying to marry my work and Mike Porter's work and others on concentrated advantage with the work of Bob Sampson and Pat Sharkey, and the brilliant work in urban sociology of concentrated disadvantage. We see a metropolis where concentrated advantage and concentrated disadvantage sit side by side. And I could talk, trust me, I could talk forever about this, but just 2 or 3 quick more points. The subtitle of this book, The New Urban Crisis, The Rise of Winner-Take-All Urbanism, Divided Cities in the Patchwork Metropolis. What we now see is a pattern of winner-take-all urbanism on steroids, where because of globalization, and I'll try to make this as simple as I can, and the book is more discursive than this. In our world, if you look at globalization, what it did was not only erode national borders, but it took a set of national champions and turned them into a set of global industries. And a lot of these old, locally protected firms fell by the wayside, and in the immortal words of Herb Simon, You got in globalization a distribution of firms, but actually this distribution of firms, my dear friend Rob Axtell figured this out at Carnegie Mellon, he's now at George Mason. You began to see in the distribution of firms globally a ZIF distribution, a rank order distribution. In cities, national systems of cities always had this rank order distribution, but globally, we didn't. What the book argues subtextually is we're moving to a system, a global system, where national borders have been eroded, and we're now seeing a true global competition of cities where the big and the most competitive and the most vibrant and the most open start to take on this winner-take-all phenomenon. And what we're beginning to see in New York and London and San Francisco is this winner-take-all pattern on steroids, driving housing prices up, creating ever greater inequality, creating a terrible backlash. And I just want to end on this because I want time for questions. Trust me, I could talk about this for another hour. What really scares me, I'm all for a society that says to financial people, look, you got to stop taking such a large share. This is crazy. The share of returns going to the financial markets now is insane. I'm all for a society that says we have to do better with distribution. And our work shows, and other work shows, very useful work by the IMS, by the OECD, by many other people, not only Piketty, others, that show that if you have better distribution, you can still have efficiency and entrepreneurship. There isn't a zero-sum trade-off. I'm all for that. What really scares me now is the attack on technological innovation that's bubbling up, particularly in places like San Francisco. The idea that technologically, entrepreneurially, creative destruction, companies and their employees are somehow the root of a new evil. And one of the things I want to do with this book is to make the case that while inequality and housing affordability and winner-take-all urbanization and globalization and the infestation of cities with the global super rich and rentiers are a problem, we have to disentangle this part of the issue. That, in fact, we need to figure out a way, and it's going to be quite difficult, as our cities become ever more propulsive centers of innovation and entrepreneurship and startup, it makes no sense to damp down that entrepreneurial and innovative impulse. We have to figure out ways to create a more inclusive urbanism. Anyway, it's a very short discussion of that, but I wanted to leave time for questions and fire away. I'm open game. So who wants to start? Please. Could you please stand up so other people, not because of me, because other people could hear you?
Hi, Rich. Thanks for that fascinating talk. Good to see you. Immigration. So we face a crisis of innovation. This city, Rome, is facing a crisis of innovation. People are fleeing intolerant places for tolerant places and jobs. And this is putting enormous strain on the politics and the institutions. What should cities do?
So therein is winner-take-all urbanism. Places that, for a variety of reasons, they may be intolerant, they may not have the innovative institutions, it could be a whole variety of innovations, somehow don't enable that clustering effect, and the talent and skill and firms leave. And you get this unbalanced, winner-take-all, unequal system. You know, I'm very simple on this, and I'm a simple believer in Jane Jacobs, that cities should invest in the small things that create quality of place and create innovative potential. So the things that can't move. Cities should stop bribing companies, stop building giant stadiums, invest in local technological capabilities. You know, Pittsburgh, it's finally paying off. 100 years of investment, 120 years of investment in places like Carnegie Mellon, then coupled with things that make the city more open-minded and capable and reuse old buildings, and it begins to take off. The problem is we're seeing in the United States, not only in Europe, we're seeing our world cleave. You know, I wrote this piece for the New York Times, why red states might be delivering a higher quality of life. It's easy to deliver, you know, when you have low housing prices and a lot of gas and oil and not a lot of dynamic growth, you can deliver this old quote-unquote American dream cheaply. Building an innovative, knowledge-driven society is very expensive. It takes public investments in universities, public investments in knowledge development, public investments in transit, and it's a much more expensive thing to do. But I think there's a recipe there. There's the beginnings of a recipe for what cities can do. Invest in themselves, invest in skill, invest in the public development and knowledge, but stay open-minded and tolerant. That'd be my simple formula. All right, I'm done. No hard questions. I can go home, get coffee. Yeah, and Peter, if you can help me too.
Do you see any disconnection between what politics, which tends to remain national,
Yep.
and this, can we call it this global cosmopolitan shift? And how are we going to confront that disconnection?
So this is a big part of my life. A big part of my life and your life is building groups like this, which are cosmopolitan, which are global. And look at what DRUID has achieved. I mean, it's sort of remarkable, the breadth of this. My own view of this was very simple-minded, and I'm not sure I'm right anymore. My own view of this was the way to do this was to build groups of mayors. So my own way of doing this was to partner with people like Ben Barber, the political theorist, and he calls it a global parliament of mayors, to begin to develop a collective of mayors who would be a counterweight to the strongly, I don't want to say because there are cosmopolitan global leaders, nationalistic bent of national level politicians. My skepticism of my own solution is that mayors may not have the power base. That in some way I naively believed that mayors could rule the world, to turn Ben's phrase. Now I'm more nervous that mayors alone can't solve these problems. And partly that comes from looking at the real problem in the developing world of what I'm coming to call urbanization without growth. You know, we've all assumed all along, goes back to your point, that growth and urbanization go hand in hand. Now we're beginning to see, and there's good research that shows this has happened again, this is a historical thing that recurs, that we're getting rampant urbanization in the developing world with not only not growth, but greater impoverishment. So I think mayors are an important part of that solution, but I think we're going to have to build a case for nation states to come together in a new way, and in a time, as we've just heard, where the returns to globalization are very concentrated and spiky, that gets harder to do. You get a backlash and a reactionism. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Roel Rutten. I'm from Tilburg University, the Netherlands. You have a chapter in one of my edited volumes, and thank you very much for that.
Thank you
because
for asking
people
us.
always ask for your chapter, not mine, in that book. I came to this fragmentation that you mentioned in cities from a slightly different angle, and I'm as concerned and worried about it as you. What I'm interested in is how social space, where knowledge creation happens, connects to physical place. And you see happening that the creative class lives in quite different bubbles than the rest of us. So how do we approach this from a geographical perspective? How can we look at the city as an analytic phenomenon when it's so fragmented? Can you reflect on that?
This is a big, you may enjoy the new book, who knows, but this is a big part of the new book, that in fact innovation in cities requires a shared space, a shared public sense, and a sense of a commons where different kinds of socioeconomic, demographic, racial, ethnic people can meet and mingle. It requires not only an economical diversity, but a physical diversity. And that one of the things that's happening, as you rightly point out, but I think driven less by the technical innovators perhaps, and much more by the incursion of the global super rich, who look at these cities as a giant safe deposit box. I mean, we've looked at this in great detail. So what's happening, of course, is our cities are becoming privatized. And they're becoming almost like urban suburbs. I have all the wrong words for this, say it better in the book, but they're becoming privatized. Not only this, but they're becoming cities that are not occupied. So whereas a city in the past was occupied by people who live there and interact and build companies and all of this ferment, our great cities like London and New York and Paris are becoming not only gentrified, they're becoming plutocratized. And this really eats away at that innovation substrate of these cities. And it's a big challenge. I think in our own world, London has gone the farthest out on this ledge. Manhattan is getting there, but of course New York, as Jane Jacobs always reminded me, is quite big and there's quite different areas, but parts of Manhattan are becoming like this. So in a way, Jane Jacobs had the best answer to this, and I use this all the time. She said, Richard, when a place gets boring, even the rich people leave. Very pragmatic insight, but the idea that this innovation impetus is going to start to shift, I think that there's both an issue for the incumbent winner-take-all leaders, creates potentialities for some of the smaller cities that can position themselves to succeed. But I see this as a very big issue.
Hello. Thank you for a really, really interesting presentation, and most of all for a presentation without PowerPoint slides. So that was very refreshing and actually focused us on the speech itself. I'm also very pleased that you touched on the topic of inequality, and one of the people before me asked you a question on immigration. I think that I live in London, and my impression is that the backlash against immigration is actually prompted by inequality.
Yep.
And in this context, I'd like to sort of ask you for your views on an argument that a colleague of ours, Alfonso Gambardella, had made several years ago with an economist called David Wolff. If I remember the paper well, because it's about 10 years ago, it argued that the genesis of the new inequality actually lay in the lack of complementarity between skilled and unskilled workers. So the breakdown of Taylorism in a way. I just want your views on that.
So here in the book, and we have a new report coming out on this called The Rise of the Service Class. So what happened to create inequality was two things. Obviously globalization and this erosion of national borders and the creation of specialized centers around the world, which made it hard to develop lots of locally medium-skill, high-wage jobs. But the other thing is this simple fragmentation between high returns for high-skilled jobs and terrible low returns for unskilled jobs. So in my own parlance, a third of the workforce, roughly in the advanced world, are members of the highly skilled, creative class, knowledge workers. About 20% are members of this blue-collar, medium-skill, high-wage, factory, family-supporting job. But remember, that 20% includes transport and construction and maintenance workers. There are less than 5% of the workforce who actually make things in most of the advanced world. And then there's about 45 to 50% of the workforce who do routine service work. Food preparation and service, retail and wholesale trade, child care, home care, personal services. And I just drawn a story my father always told me. He said, Rich, when I was a young boy and had to leave school, it took 9 of us to make a family wage in the 1930s. He said, I came back from World War II, and as if by magic, my one job in a factory was a good job. I could get married, buy a house, put my 2 kids through Catholic school and through college, but it wasn't magic, as my father knew. There were a set of institutions we built. Unions, in the United States, the Wagner Act, collective bargaining, a social safety net, which turned shitty jobs into good jobs. So my view of this is and I look at our candidates in the United States, and I look at what's happening in Central Europe. Keep the immigrants out there stealing our jobs. Bring manufacturing back. Upskill, Mrs. Clinton, I love her. Upskill, increase education, Mr. Obama. Bring manufacturing back. It won't work. Not when you have half the jobs in the most advanced countries in the world that are low wage, low skill by definition. So we have to upskill those jobs. And the best work done on this is a young woman named Zainet Tan, who comes out of the operations program at the MIT Sloan School, who wrote a great book called The Good Job Strategy, based on her field work and quantitative work, which shows the same thing we found in Japanese factories. If you take unskilled work and you take unskilled workers, you organize them in teams, you invest in quality and continuous improvement, you see them as a site of innovation, you can boost productivity, boost profits, and boost wages. So we need a renewed commitment to creating a new set of bargains, if you will, in a new compact, to upskilling low-skill work. If we don't do that, and that will help create demand, it will help create a more virtuous circle. If we don't do that, I am terrified of the outcomes of this divide, because this divide is not only socioeconomic. Remember I said it's spatial. So in the old society, my uncle, who was the vice president of Colgate-Palmolive, and my father lived next door to one another. They would never even live within a 20-mile radius today. We not only have socioeconomic division, we have geographic and spatial division, and that hardens, right, as our dear friend Bill Bishop wrote in a book of Bill's Sword, that hardens into a politics of opposition. And to my mind, if I look at that holds a real potential for terrible reactionism. So I think we have to build new social institutions that upgrade those low-skilled jobs. And the book talks a lot about that.
We are running short of time. I think this is a very nice note to end on.
Thank you, Peter.
And I think we should thank Richard for being
Thank
with
you.
us today.
And I'll be around.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Peter, thank you. You're too kind. Thank you. Thank you, guys.